Welcome, everyone, to Cannabis Rescheduling, what it means for your business. I would like to go ahead and introduce our lovely panelists and speakers for the day. We've got Helena Lynch, partner at SAX, Allison Kirchhoffer, Director of Cannabis, and Betsy Morum, Director of Client Accounting Services here at SAX. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off swiftly to Allison.
Very good. All right. Good afternoon. First and foremost, I want to say thank you to you, Imani, and your team for handling all the logistics and getting this webinar set up. We really appreciate all of your efforts. And also thank you to all of our attendees here today. Thank you for joining after we rescheduled this webinar on rescheduling. Happy to have you. Here's just a quick slide about SAX's cannabis practice. If you're not already familiar, we have a growing team here dedicated to cannabis accounting, to CFO, tax, and audit as well. So some of our services are on the screen there. Of course, if anybody has any questions or want to learn more, please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to anyone about what we do. So our purpose for this webinar today is to discuss key considerations from an accounting and tax perspective with this rescheduling that happened about a month ago. We are here to answer your questions as best we can. So we're going to start with a rundown of the DOJ Final Rule and a timeline of how we got here, what that's all about. Prefacing all of this with we are not lawyers, but we do work with some fantastic lawyers in the space. We're going to focus on what we're thinking about as CPAs in the space and some of the questions that we've been receiving from clients since this all went down. So as Imani said, we're leaving plenty of time at the end for questions. So we will answer what we can live. So throw them in the chat as we're talking. And anything that we feel needs some further research or we're not able to get to it in the time that we have, then we will follow up with everybody on every question, after today's webinar. So Betsy, I'm going to pass it off to you. Betsy is hailing from Minnesota today, where there is a very fun, lively cannabis market brewing out there. So, Betsy, I'm going to pass it to you to give us the rundown on the final rule.
Thanks, Allison. So the key update is really that on April 22nd, the DOJ issued the final rule. And the important takeaway there is that it has created two paths for cannabis. So state licensed medical cannabis operators moved to Schedule 3 immediately. And that's very meaningful for them because Section 280E no longer applies to those medical operators at the federal level. The broader adult use question is still working through an expedited DEA hearing process, which is scheduled to start June 29th. So obviously that's just a month away. We should know more about the possibility of adult use getting rescheduled after that. So it's a very interesting, exciting time, lots of speculation, and I'm looking forward to that hearing to see what they decide, if anything. And just as a note that at the time of the April 2026 reclassification, there were 40 states that had legalized medical marijuana. So big impact across the country. And if we think about the timeline of how we got here, the process really started almost 3 years ago when the Health and Human Services recommended moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. But in May 2024, the DOJ and DEA published the proposed rule, but the DEA later announced an administrative hearing, which was delayed until January 2025. Then in December 2025, President Trump issued an executive order directing the Attorney General to move the rulemaking forward as quickly as possible. I think everyone was very surprised by that news. led to a flurry of posts on LinkedIn, as I'm sure everyone experienced. But that ultimately led to the final rule being issued on April 22nd. So the process has taken quite a bit of time, but things really accelerated just in the last few months.
And obviously, just to jump in real quick, there's been a ton of advocacy for decades leading up to where we
Yes,
start our timeline here in
right.
2023.
It's a good point to add, Allison. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Helena, I'm going to go over some of the tax decisions made and not made at this point because obviously it varies depending upon medical and not. Treasury and the IRS did announce that they're going to issue some guidance in the near future, whether that's going to be this month, next month, or hopefully in this near future, it could be as late as later this year, as they've done it in the past. Rescheduling basically, as Betsy mentioned, removes all the 280E expenses for businesses in the sense that they're no longer limited to not taking deductions. They can take the deductions like any other business can. And there's additional credits and stuff, which I'll mention in the next slide. There's also some guidance going to be required for the mixed activity businesses, those that may have medical and non-medical, or adult use cannabis. We'll have to determine how the allocation of the activity is going to be done, whether the IRS gives detailed guidance remains to be seen. And then, of course, there's going to be a transition rule as to exactly when this is all going to take place. Excuse me, if the change will occur effective January 1st or a different point in 2026, and also potentially any retroactive changes that may come about. Next slide. So as far as some tax benefits, I'll just give a quick overview of what has happened or may happen. And again, these tax benefits relate to medical use. Of course, any adult use cannabis, there's technically no changes as of now. Whether that changes later this month into early next month will remain to be seen. So in terms of reduced tax liability for entities that are corporations, that's an additional 21% of all those expenses that you can now get a deduction for. So for any $50,000 of additional expenses, for instance, you'd save about another $10,000 of taxes at the corporate level. You also potentially will get what they call the qualified business income deduction, which businesses get a 20%, basically a 20% break on the tax of whatever the entities earn if they're S corps or LLCs. So of course, that's very beneficial. In addition to getting the additional expenses, you'll also get a credit. There is a potential for medical expense deductions that would be more on the individual side of the taxes. And as long as it's done by prescription, it can't be a state approval at this point. From what's been read right now, this could change, but it would have to be a medical prescription written, and there's a potential for deductions on your personal income tax return. Just to note that medical expenses in general are not deductible until they exceed a certain amount of your income anyway, and you'd also have to be itemizing on your personal return. So in general, people don't get a lot of medical expense deductions on their individual returns unless they have excessively high medical expenses. We're not sure exactly the effective date of the 2026 tax planning, for 26 tax planning. Hopefully they'll make it effective January 1st to make everybody's lives easier. It is possible that they could do it as of the April 23rd date, which obviously then that would require allocation of income and expenses from the time period before and after that date. Last year when they passed the different bill, the One Big Beautiful Act, there was multiple dates involved. So it's hard to say what they're going to do right now. Again, like I said, hopefully they'll make it easier for everybody and pick a January 1st date as the effective date for accounting and tax and everything. There's also a question of amending prior year returns if this could be potentially retroactive to a prior year. Whether you should amend the returns, whether you're going to put yourself at more risk, or should you file a protective claim. It's hard to say right now what they're going to include when they finally pass all the bills, as far as the IRS goes. In past, even when they initially come out with their first bill regarding any change in the tax code, it's usually not 100% clear on certain issues, so it'll probably be revised as time goes on. But there are risks, even if you do go back and amend prior year returns, they could still potentially question items. So it's something to look out for and keep in mind. But again, there's risks involved in any amending of returns. But again, if it's medical, it's one set of rules. Obviously, adult use cannabis is totally different. Right now, it'd be very risky to touch any of those. I would not, you don't recommend adult use cannabis is being amended at this point. There's some other changes to potentially look at, whether it's for medical right now or if anything is changed in the adult use purpose. Potential changes of your entities. In the past, the entity structures have been set up so that try to get the best benefit from a tax standpoint, but as well as liability reasons, and as well as separating entities, let's say the cannabis one from maybe a real estate entity. Those still may need to be separate entities, but it is possible that if you have 2, 3, 4 entities, you may want to combine them into less entities at some point, depending upon what exactly the ruling comes down. So it's something you might look at for 26, 27. We'll see when everything comes out. A couple of other items, there's some other business tax credits that many of these entities may be eligible for, like an R&D credit, or other depreciation cost seg potential credits, things like that. So basically, for now at least, medical cannabis has many options in terms of taxes, and there's depending upon their individual situations. And as far as adult cannabis, we'll wait and see what happens. The one thing is potential exposure. So any year you take any additional expenses, such as the non-280E and such, the government is looking, and they're gonna you're potentially at a higher risk for an audit, or at least or owing money back for those years. That's why we always tell our clients when they're taking the non-280E is to kind of keep that tax money aside, because we don't know if and when the IRS may come back, and they have a few years to do so. So basically, and some other court cases that have come up recently have actually made it sound a little riskier in terms of non-280E. I think it's back to you, Allison.
Great. Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So my portion here is really a food for thought kind of portion. So I'm not necessarily going to give you answers to any of these topics I threw on the slide here, but it's just things that have come up, things that I've been thinking about as I've been reading about all of this. Taking a step back. So what has happened here? The federal government has bifurcated very clearly medical marijuana from adult use. Of course, cannabis is her name. I say marijuana because that's how it's listed in the Controlled Substances Act, right? And from our perspective as accountants, whether we're on the tax side or the accounting side or CFO, I think at the end of the day, it's really important that we're careful until that guidance is issued. So we're waiting on that as of today. And I'm looking forward to having a follow-up webinar after the summer hearing and after we get more guidance. But you want to be careful with, are we going to amend? Are we going to change our accounting methodology? How are we going to allocate between activities? How are we going to document what products fall in or out of Schedule 1 or Schedule 3, and those protective claim considerations. So obviously, of course, speak to your CPA about all of those questions. We're going to expect to see more complex cost accounting for those mixed use allocations. So if there are businesses that have both Schedule 1 and Schedule 3 activities, we need, that guidance to help us determine how we're going to handle that. And also, the effective date, whether it is January 1st, April 23rd, as Helena said, or the date it was published in the Federal Register, which I believe was the 28th. But now we're in a place for our medical operators, at least, where there is a pathway to compliance with the Department of Justice that did not exist previously. So now, yes, so we have a pathway to compliance. That means additional fees. And it's important now that these medical operators only transact with other DEA registered businesses. So that came out of the final rule from the Department of Justice. Medical operators have to register with the DEA. So I was speaking with one of our cannabis-focused CFOs here. His name is Nick Agrippino. Some of you may know him. He's very active in New York and across the country. And what he and I were talking about were some of the planning considerations with DEA registration and doing a cost analysis there. So that's something that we're talking to clients about. coming back to my points here on the slide, I'm just going to go top to bottom to keep myself organized. First point there, will rescheduling even prevail? So this is a conversation I've had with a few attorneys. There's been a petition filed by Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAM, and the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association contesting the DOJ final rule. So what is going to happen with that is there going to be a stay, is the rule going to be stayed? Again, not an attorney, so I think I'm using the correct phrase there. Ultimately, is all of this going to be put on pause and delayed? That's something that I've been monitoring very closely just to see, whether or not, like I said, will rescheduling prevail? My next point there, banking, payment processing, lending, all of the issues and hurdles that the cannabis industry has been facing for years now has gotten better to some degree, but we're still, dealing with a lot of workarounds in these areas, in particular on the lending side. There's a chance that this will open up. It's not going to happen overnight. It's interesting from an accounting perspective. I'm seeing some larger firms now get into the cannabis space, and I think there's a direct relationship between, this rescheduling and that decision by these firms. We may be seeing the same for some larger commercial banks. I would expect to see that that benefit to come about for medical operators, more so than adult use as of now. But that's something that will potentially have a huge impact on the industry and on individual operators. My next point there, the DEA deferred to state laws essentially, right? The order says FDA approved products or an operator that is licensed by a state medical program. In deferring to state laws, there's been some questions that have come up about whether or not these state laws are compliant with the federal treaty obligations. So, the obvious example that's been coming up, and again, I'm not an attorney, so I'll just say, what I'm thinking about is, there's typically a prescription required for a Schedule III drug. State laws, a lot of them have the medical card, right? You're not actually getting a prescription. So is that going to change, fundamentally the way these operators are able to function? I know it varies state to state. I'll just say that, as far as how that looks. One of the first questions that came to mind for me was, okay, so can we have telehealth? Can we have interstate commerce? Can we have, these drugs, mail order? Again, a lot of these questions are going to be scrutinized by the attorneys in the space. But it's an interesting development there as far as what interstate commerce will look like. Again, varies state to state. Some state laws prohibit that in the state regime. So, and then hemp-derived THC. I know that there's been a lot happening in that space over the past 9 months or so. Since November, hemp-derived THC, synthetic THC, intoxicating hemp, whatever you refer to it as, is now Schedule I, unless something changes between now and this upcoming November. So, that's a huge wrench for a lot of these operators, especially out in, Minnesota, where Betsy is located, where, the state laws there built in a low potency license option. And now, that sort of loophole was closed, right? So one question that has been coming up, whether or not how this rescheduling impacts hemp-derived THC. It is Schedule I, it is not Schedule III. So for those businesses now, previously 280E was not necessarily applied unless something changes. We're going to be looking at 280E impact on these businesses. And then my last point there now, new entrants to the market. We'll see, what rescheduling opens up there. Some of the larger big business that we may see come into the space. So my last point that I'll leave everybody with, and then we'll move into some Q&A. We'll see what comes through. Um, Cannabis is the only controlled substance that there's really no precedent in that it's the only controlled substance with the state legal recreational sales happening as well. So what does that mean? It's, the hearing coming up June 29th specifically is it's expedited in that it should end by July 15th. We'll have, factual evidence presented by experts and, expert opinion there. How are you, it's to me it feels like we're fitting square peg into a round hole kind of a situation in that, how can we call something adult use or recreational and have it listed? Before, when everything was Schedule 1, enforcement was not there. This is going to, I think, potentially change that. Because essentially, if you're trafficking cannabis and you're not compliant, in other words, not registered with the DEA, then it's an illegal activity at the federal level. So I'll just say my ideal situation is that we see, coming out of the June, July hearing, ideally we see adult use cannabis treated now like Tylenol or tobacco, just descheduled altogether, or we might see no change at all. So we'll see what happens there, but we'll certainly be watching that closely. It will be live streamed. And again, focusing on what enforcement will look like now after. Is this really a win for the industry to be determined, I think. In particular, I'm thinking about our card licensees in New York. June hearings, adult use must register with the DEA. Let's say that's the result there. Part of that application, that registration process, has you identify whether or not you've been convicted of any drug convictions. What is that going to mean for these card licensees who were prioritized in New York? So that's, not to end it necessarily on a less optimistic note, but there's, at the end of all this, at this point, we're still watching very closely. Like, what is this all going to look like? Of course, 280E goes away for our medical operators. That's fantastic. They must also now register with the DEA, and there's a lot more, fees involved there. So we're doing those cost analysis, and again, watching it closely. I think at this point, I can pass it back to you, Imani, and let's see if any questions have come through the chat.
Yeah, perfect.
Q&A.
Well, before we jump into Q&A, I just want to thank all of our speakers today. You all did a great job breaking this down for our guests. Now we are moving into our Q&A portion. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, or you can utilize the Q&A feature for Zoom. We do have 2 questions. I am not the expert, so feel free to correct me if I'm pronouncing anything incorrectly, but I think this question reads, is a non-280E position stronger now with rescheduling?
Great question. Helena, do you want to take that?
Sure. In adult use, definitely not. I wouldn't find it any stronger. If anything, it may have gotten a little weaker in recent months because of the cases that have, been denied non-280E treatment. So it's definitely still risky for adult use, and I'd say if not, slightly riskier.
Yeah, there was recent news that came out that the IRS has actually filed suit. They're suing TerraSend, who famously had filed an amended return for 2020, and then they received a large refund. So again, like Helena mentioned, if you're taking this no 280 position, set that money aside as best you can. There's a lot of different arguments out there, and so anyone who has taken a no 280 position, definitely recommend setting up time to speak to your CPA and your attorney and just sort of reevaluating the landscape now.
Okay, thank you, ladies. And then we do have a second question here, and this one reads, any changes to 471C methodologies?
In general, there's not a change. You could potentially change it under certain circumstances, but the one thing you don't want to do is change every year. So if you've set your 471C one way, I would recommend, unless there's some major change, consistently keeping it.
Yeah.
Allison, I don't know, you may have something to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I'll just briefly explain what that is. So 471C is an internal revenue code section that is available to all small businesses. Most of our dispensary clients take a 471C position because it allows them in a compliant way, as long as you're reasonable and consistent, allocate more costs to inventory and then cost of goods sold to lower your taxable income. So the question has come up, do we change this now with rescheduling? If you're adult use, like Helena said, no change there. But it is worth having, that conversation. In general, it's, okay to make a change going forward in response to a change in tax law. But as Helena said, the issue would be switching back and forth, right? You're implementing this costing methodology because this is the way you think about your business. And we went forward with implementing this for your bookkeeping and for your tax purposes. You want to be very careful about making that change. So again, a conversation to have with your CPA. I know that different CPAs, different firms sort of take a slightly different approach with 471C. But the question of whether or not you should change at this point with adult use, we're it's a no till further guidance. And again, we'll see what comes out of the hearing that's scheduled to end July 15th. So just a couple weeks.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you to our guests for those questions. If anyone didn't get a chance to drop their question into the chat, I am just going to leave this right here so you can contact any of our team members and connect with them on LinkedIn. Again, we are always here and happy to help you through these changes and to get your questions answered. So I will leave this on the screen for just a bit. Thank you again to our wonderful speakers. Thank you to everyone who attended. As they've all mentioned, we've got another ruling coming up, so we will keep you all in the loop. But thank you.